Welcome, everyone, to the 15th installment of the Senior Leadership Insights series sponsored by the Graduate School. Today's conversation is offered in partnership with the Medical Science Training Program. The series was created and developed by a group of alumni volunteers from the Graduate Board of Visitors. My name is Melissa Bostrom, and I am the Assistant Dean for Graduate Student Professional Development in the Graduate School. I'd like to thank my colleague Angela Eberts, our Director of Development, for her partnership in producing this series. To make the most of our focused time together, I'll address a few logistics up front. We'll begin the conversation with 6 key questions that we ask each of our featured guests. And after that, we'll welcome questions from the audience. If you'd like to speak, you can use the raise hand option accessible through the reactions button in the lower right corner of your Zoom window. This session is being recorded, so if you prefer not to appear in the recording, please keep your video muted and share your questions in the chat. With those details out of the way, I'd like now to introduce Dr. Christopher Contos, Professor of Medicine and Director of the Duke Medical Science Training Program, which trains physician scientists in dual MD, PhD degrees. The Contos Lab studies the molecular mechanisms of angiogenesis and vascular remodeling. I was interested to learn that one element of his research involves using a super 3D scanner described by one science writer as Superman's X-ray vision to visualize the blood vessels inside mouse legs in an effort to better understand peripheral artery disease in humans. He received his MD training at Virginia Commonwealth University and completed a fellowship in cardiology medicine here at Duke. Dr. Contos, I'll turn things over to you to introduce our special guest today, Dr. Richard Colvin.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. And it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker today, or our guest, Dr. Colvin, Rich Colvin, who's a graduate of the Medical Scientist Training Program back in 95 and 96. So obviously speaking to us today with respect to his training in the PhD, the graduate program here at Duke, and he'll tell us what program that was, and as he gives us some background. But again, I'm proud to have him as a graduate of our program, then went on to do his residency. So it's a little bit different than probably what most of you on the call are interested in doing, since he does have some clinical training, but of course now is in industry. And so he'll tell us a little bit about that. So without further ado, Rich, welcome to back to Duke remotely. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Chris. It's so great to see you again, too. And thank you for having me and inviting me to come to this forum.
Yeah, fantastic. And Rich is actually just back from South Africa, so he may be a little bit jet lagged, but this should be a good conversation. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off by, Rich, just tell us a little bit about your background, some briefly about your training in the graduate school, and then perhaps a little bit about the clinical training that you did that got you to industry where you are now with Bluebird Bio.
Yeah, no, Chris. Yeah, I started out at Duke, right? So I did some research at Cornell as an undergraduate, and I was very lucky to be accepted into the MD, PhD, the MSTP program at Duke. And so I had 2 years clinically, and then I went into Mariano Garcia Blanco's lab to do my PhD training. And the early part of my career was all focused on HIV. HIV, it was in the 90s, right? The HIV pandemic was raging, and it was the most important global health problem there was. And I thought it would be important to be part of that. So I was working with Mariano on some really early molecular virology research into HIV. And that was essential for me just to get my grounding as a scientist, but also to think about what's important to me as I would go forward. And it was really important to me to work on something that was important for other people. And that's what was working on HIV, was it like back then. And I am so lucky that I had Mariano as an advisor, as my PhD advisor, and just a personal friend, a mentor, because I learned so much from him. And one of the things that I would always say is that the greatest things I learned from my mentors have been things that you don't really learn in a textbook, right? So that's what's so great. And so Mariano, let's just put it this way, he's a very passionate man who's a very good scientist. And he wants to answer good, hard questions. He doesn't want to do the easy things, right? And so, one of the important things I learned from him was that if you have a good question, find a way to answer it. Just because you don't know how to do it right now, well, let's go figure it out. And so we did that. He and I got onto this kick of looking at an RNA structure. I mean, he was an MD PhD, he still is an MD PhD, and he was a molecular biologist. And the next thing you know, we're doing structural biochemistry and doing an MR spectroscopy. But it worked, right? And we found the right people to collaborate with. We learned and we did it. And it was a huge lesson for me that if you have a good question, you should go and answer it. And that's what we did. So, this is where, once I finished and got my PhD in Mariano's lab, though, where I ended up going, though, is finishing medical school. Took another year to do that. And then I did a medical residency up here in Boston at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in internal medicine. And then again, I was still focused on HIV at that time. So I continued my medical training in infectious diseases with the goal of being an HIV doc and HIV researcher. And I did that at Mass General Hospital across town. And so when I started my postdoc then, which a lot of you will be doing as well, I ended up working with Andy Luster, and we were working at my first project there was looking at HIV entry into T cells through CCR5. One thing led to another, and suddenly I was off that track and looking at more like chemokine receptor signaling, which was a really cool thing. It's G protein coupled receptor signaling, an important path. And at this point, I'm thinking my whole life, my goal is to be an academic physician scientist. I'm in the right place, doing the right things. I'm enjoying the science that I was doing. After a few years, though, of working in sort of this very basic immunology, where I wasn't exactly an immunologist at this point, and I was losing touch a little bit with the HIV research world, I was getting a little antsy, but it was all okay, right? Things are still good. And my clinic had started to morph from because I finished my fellowship and was now in clinic and at Mass General Chelsea Hospital, which Mass General Chelsea Healthcare Center. And at Chelsea, it's an amazing place. It's I don't know if any of you know Boston, but it's a part of Boston where almost everybody there is an immigrant. Many without documentation, and so there are a lot of health problems that go along with all of that. And so my clinic started out all HIV, then it became slowly but surely morphed into a hepatitis clinic because we had no one to take care of the patients with hepatitis. And so that was amazing. But my worlds were so distant. On the one hand, I was doing this very basic immunology where I could not see having any impact on patients in my lifetime anyway. In meantime, I'm in doing down in the trenches for sure in clinic where there's a lot of people without jobs, a lot of people living in multi-generational housing situations. There's a lot of addiction. There's a lot of domestic violence. There's a lot of people trying to get their kids to school, all these kind of problems. And then meanwhile, there's of course HIV, there's hepatitis C. There's a lot of these diseases that unfortunately travel in these circles. And so it was really weird to have those two things together. But everybody knows, in our field, a lot of people know each other. And this was at a time when all of Big Pharma was starting to work on therapies for hepatitis C. And I had never seen myself heading into the industry way. That was just not my plan, right? But I get this call from somebody at Novartis and says, hey, I know you have hepatitis C. You see a lot of patients with hepatitis C. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And they go, well, we're looking for a infectious disease physician scientist who knows something about hepatitis. And back in 2008, there weren't that many of us, to be fair. And they said, we'd love to see if you would consider working with us as we start to develop our therapies and we start bringing them into the clinic. And I said, I don't know. I never really considered this. But so I kept talking to them. And one thing led to another. And I thought this would be really cool because I know what we had to treat patients with hepatitis C was terrible at that time. It was interferon and ribavirin, and it was miserable therapy that was essentially like chemotherapy. And I said, if we have something better, that would be great. And so one thing leads to another. And I start talking to them, and I'm looking at the people, and they were a lot of people just like me who had the same kind of training, the same kind of background. They talked the same. Some of them still had their clinics. And I thought this would be great. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And And I did, and for me, it worked out really well. Now so then I spent 9 years at Novartis, and that was a long time in industry terms to stay in one place. And a lot of the reason I felt that way is because the science was amazing and the people I was working with were amazing, and we were doing stuff that was important for other people. And one great thing about being in a big company like that is you don't get bored of what you're doing, because you end up, when one thing ends, you can move to something else. And I started out knowing something about HIV and hepatitis, but before long, I ended up working on vaccines. I ended up working on leishmania. I ended up working on all kind of respiratory viruses. And what was interesting is I had this opportunity to work on uh, a gene therapy for hearing loss, and it was a big change. But you could never do that in academia, but you could do it in industry. And
Yeah.
when I did
Yeah,
that,
let me jump in and ask you, Rich. So
sure,
your background obviously a little different from most on the call, with both the MD and the PhD and then
yeah,
clinical training. One thing I've always been impressed with here at Duke, and probably a lot of other major academic medical centers, is that I imagine most of the students on the call, their projects are clinically focused. They have some clinical spin, so they bring a little bit of that to the table. So you went to industry. Tell us a little bit about like the PhD training and how that, as opposed to just the medical training, really kind of situated for you, set you up for that job, both at Novartis and then when you shifted over to Bluebird.
yeah. It's really important. The PhD training is critical, in my opinion, for both the critical to me being able to perform and critical for my success. Because no matter what, the key is to be a good scientist. That's where you got to start in these kind of jobs. You need to understand the science. And from my point of view, that's what separates somebody who has a lot of success in the clinical development space. And of course, if you're doing the sort of the discovery work at the other end, of course, you need to have that background as a scientist. But even in the clinical development space, you just see it all the time that the people who have MD, PhDs, in a sense, that's like the ideal position or the ideal training in order to do that position well.
Yeah, and obviously, like you said, you jumped around a bit, which is, I think, one of the things that can scare students sometimes. You're so focused on one project, and then you get pulled to another. Did you find that to be difficult or more enjoyable?
I found it enjoyable. I think it varies on the person, right? I mean, one of the things I was struggling with as I was finishing my postdoc, starting my own lab, was that I said I have to be focused now on chemokine signaling for the next 10 years. And that's great, right? For some people. On the other hand, I felt like, wow, I'm not sure I want to do that. And once I got to industry, I was able to move around and make those changes, which was good for me.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the science skills. Obviously, being a good scientist is critical for, getting any position in science, whether it's research, I mean, industry or academia. What other skills do you think were necessary for you to take on a position in industry? And, maybe how can students get those skills?
One of the things I think of, as especially as you advance in your career, and the more senior you are in a position, what's interesting, there's a saying that people have that EQ is more important than IQ. And that gets summed up across everything, right? To get in the door, you need to have that scientific background and those scientific skills. But you have them, right? You're going to have them. And what ends up happening is you advance further. It becomes more about getting stuff done, and to get stuff done in this world. And this is true, I believe, in academia right now too, because the scope of the projects we're all working on, true in industry, because the scope of what the work we're trying to do, you need to work with a lot of other people. And to do that at every level, your leadership skills are critical. And those leadership skills are something that they're not exactly taught directly. At least when I was there, they weren't. There's some you learn a little bit, but I think that's one of the critical things. The more you can learn about leadership, the better. And I know when you talk to some of the people who train leaders and who do leadership training, or recruiters who are interested in this kind of thing, what you usually hear is the good leaders are those that enjoy leadership training. The people who think they don't need it are not very good leaders. And so it's one of those things to embrace and to enjoy, because it's not necessarily something that comes naturally to anybody. And so it's one of those things I think we should all embrace.
Yeah, great saying I just read again recently was that a good leader makes followers, a great leader makes leaders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Where do you think, so where can the students who are on the call today, where do you think they can get that sort of training? It sounds like you probably didn't have as much of it as you would have liked during your MD PhD training. Are there opportunities along the way or within industry once you make it there?
One thing that is became obvious to me is as soon as I got into industry, I was being sent to leadership training. Some people take that the wrong way. In fact, it's just the usual. It's the normal thing that people, that's where they want you to go because you start to do that. It's something that I actually think should be a bigger part of the academic training at every level, starting as students. Because it doesn't necessarily have to take a lot of time. It's one of those things that you just have to have the ideas and then get practice at it. I mean, I think one of the fortunate things as someone doing clinical training, you actually have a lot of on-the-job training in that, which you don't necessarily get when you're doing science. Because when you're a scientist, you tend to be an individual contributor for a long time, whether it's first as a graduate student, then as a postdoc, sometimes you might have a technician or two technicians, and then when you start your own lab, you might have a couple other people, but it's still it takes a long time. The thing is when you're training clinically, you start out, even when you're an intern and then a junior resident, senior resident, you're having a team to work with all the time. And you start to realize that leadership goes in every direction, and including the person who may not have anyone reporting to them directly, there's still leadership that's required in that position. So you do get a little bit more training out of it clinically, which I think does help. But if you don't have that, I do think it's something to reach out and ask. I mean, it's something that, I'm not sure. We have the right people on the call. I mean, Dr. Barber on the call and Chris and
Yeah.
as well as Melissa and Angela that could probably help and find places that there could be leadership training at Duke.
Yeah, I think there's some great opportunities with all the programs that Melissa oversees. I guess one other question I would ask in that regard is that, you had your own academic lab before you went to industry, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Do you
Small,
think,
but
yeah, but do you think it's more important for students to think about going on and doing a postdoc or staying in academia first before going to industry, or opportunities to go straight to industry and do just as well?
the amazing thing about industry is there's no path that works that's the same for everybody, right? So it's hard to come up with what's the best path. This was the really good path for me. Um, one of the things we say in clinical development is when we hire somebody to be a medical monitor, which is kind of the early place you end up being as somebody with clinical training going into clinical development. You want somebody who's actually been an attending physician so that they're making their own decisions, and you want them to have some experience doing that. While you do make plenty of decisions as a resident and as a fellow, it's a little different when all of the responsibility is on you. Um, with respect to PhDs, though, there's a lot of great opportunities for somebody right out of graduate school and industry, and there's scientific places to go, right? Scientific positions where you are a scientist. But there are also some other things that are potentially just as interesting. Going into business development, say, you don't have to necessarily know a lot about business at first. What we want a lot of times in business development is somebody who could evaluate the science. And so you may not need, it's not one of those places you necessarily need to have a postdoc behind you. And that a lot of times people who do that end up doing that for a few years. They end up getting an MBA at some point, and then they take on another role as a higher level in business development. But there definitely are, you could go in any direction you want. You could go from your own lab and have another friend who's a PhD scientist who's a postdoc with me, who's a great scientist. And he had his own lab. He built it pretty far, and then he went to Sanofi, and he enjoys working there. Leads a large immunology group there. So there's definitely every path is possible, is what I'm trying to say. Just got to figure it out and
Yeah.
and take advantage of opportunities that come your way.
Right, right. So you started out with Novartis within the industry realm, and then made the jump. I can't remember how long ago, to Bluebird Bio, and that's more gene therapy directed, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Why don't you can you tell us a little bit about what your job entails? What do you do? What's your day like?
Yeah, this is always hard. I remember asking that exact question when I was going to go to Novartis. I said, I don't understand what you want me to do. I said, if you want me to be a scientist, I can do that. If you want me to be a physician, I can do that. What is it that you're asking me to do? And the answer was, well, it's really hard to explain, but you're really smart, so you'll figure it out. I'm like, okay. So I could give you a better idea now, though, because it's now been a lot of years, and it has changed. I mean, and now being chief medical officer, I think I've got an amazing job, and I've been at Bluebird now for 5 years, and really, we have 3 programs that are very exciting, 3 gene therapy programs. They've all been approved now. So my job has changed a lot recently, because before it was all the R&D part, and we were all working, and I lead our research and development here. So our whole focus was on getting these approved. Well, now they're approved. So what do? Well, we first still have clinical studies going. So we have to make sure those keep going. But we really support the launch and trying to get these out to patients, because one of the things about gene therapy is they're incredibly transformative for patients, but they're transformative also to their bodies, and so that they have been changed forever. So once treated, we have some responsibility for them forever. So we're following more and more patients all the time and trying to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to reduce the risk for them in the future. So what do I do every day? I go to a lot of meetings. That's one thing. But what we're trying to do, though, is, I always, to that point I just made, what I always tell my group, our goal is to keep the patients who receive our therapy safe. And that doesn't mean that 100% will never have an adverse event, will never have a side effect, but it means we do whatever we can to reduce that risk. We make sure that they're effective enough so that the risk that they do have and the potential side effects are tolerable within the benefit they gain. And so that's the overarching thing. So how do we do that? Well, a lot of what I do now is get other people who are smarter than me at their job to make sure they get it done. Because as I always say, I have this group, I have a head of research, a head of biostatistics, a head of clinical research and development, a head of pharmacovigilance, and regulatory, and head of clinical operations. And each one of them can do their job way better than I can do their job. So my job is to give them direction and to say, how we're trying to get there, what we're trying to do, and what our goals are. And I generally help lead them. I mean, one of the important things I do is lead a meeting called Translational Research and Clinical Development. And that's where we go over issues, whether it's protocol amendments in our clinical studies, or if there's something, are we going to go ahead and do this study? And we have people present at those. So, there's a lot of meetings, a lot of slides, a lot of thinking to go through things. And I deal with the FDA quite a lot, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a big part of what you're doing, obviously on the clinical side, the translational side, getting it into patients does involve a different set of skills, perhaps, than many of the graduate students here might have. Again, thinking about ways that they can gain those skills. Are there classes? I think we've got some of that now at Duke with some classes in clinical and translational research, things like that. I don't know if Melissa, if you know of any other opportunities, or Rich, things you've encountered along the way for students to get exposure that way.
Well, it's interesting. If people are particularly interested in drug development, there's some really great courses out there. I know there's one at the Tufts Center for Drug Development up here in Boston. They have an amazing course. It's about 5 days, and you learn so much. They have FDA people who work at the FDA who come and talk, and they have a lot of other people from industry who want to talk, but also taking the class. And I know a lot of people who've gone to that before they went to industry, thought it was really helpful. I did that course when I was in industry for about 2 years. I wished I did it earlier because I learned so much. And there are other courses like that, but the Tufts Center for Drug Development is one of the premier the academic places that looks at drug development. And I think that's a really helpful one. In general, though, I mean, in my group too, we have PhDs in our research group, of course, and we have a number of PhDs at other places in the organization. And so, to me, the key is to talk to some of the people there. One of the things with, especially at entry-level jobs in industry, a lot of times the companies want people who are smart, and they figure they'll learn how to do it along the way. And again, it becomes it's hard to get an entry-level job in a sort of a mid-sized biotech company. You have to know something already. But in big pharma, it's a little easier to get an entry-level job. And then in really new startups is another place where one can get an entry-level job right out of graduate school or out of postdoc.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to make sure we have time for questions for the students on the call. So feel free if anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, like Melissa said, with the reactions. And glad to let you ask some questions for Dr. Colvin. Yeah, there's a great resource that Angela's put in the chat for drug development, reimbursement and regulation course in the business school.
That's a great one. That's such a complex topic that's really valuable to learn more about.
Any questions from anyone? Don't be shy.
I had actually a question came to me from one of our attendees who's not able to ask it live, but they put it in the chat. Patrick Colvin, what do you think is the most important quality to work on in leadership in industry?
Oh, that's a great question. Most important quality is, and I think this is true for almost everything. Be a good listener. Pay attention to what people are saying, because, like I said, everybody who reports to me, my leadership team, knows way more about what they're doing than I do, right? And what their job is, and so I better listen to them, right? And so, to me, that's the biggest thing. If the first thing you have to do is listen, and from there you can understand what is possible.
And Dr. Barber's got a great question for you too. It's if you could give your graduate student self, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Um, take more statistics. That's one thing. But yeah, I like that question. It's like, the letter to your younger self. And and it would be, I've kind of over the years, it hit me. And Chris, I was very lucky. Chris invited me to come to the MD PhD retreat earlier this year. And it was one of my favorite weekends that I've had in a long time, for many reasons. And when I was putting that together, I realized there's certain things that I follow all the time, especially since, you know, especially since the time that I first went to industry, and this was part of where I was. And I try to think, what do I want to do? It's really hard when your whole identity is caught up in being an academic physician scientist, which is what mine was, to make that move to go to industry. So what did that mean? And I had to think, well, why would I make this move and really upend my whole identity? And it came down to four simple things. And it was that I want to make sure that I do something that makes me happy, right? That's the first thing. And with happy, I have to be passionate about it. So, because otherwise, why am I doing it? Like, life's way too short to do something you're not passionate about. And then the third one I feel like is perhaps the most important one. And I think it leads to the other two being true, is that you got to do something that's important for someone else. If it's just important for you, that's not going to work. It's not for me anyway. And then finally, life is too short. So if you're going to work and you're going to spend that many hours a day working, you better do it with people you like.
Yeah, that's great
Just
advice.
all of those things, you win. They
Yeah,
sound simple, but then you win. It doesn't matter what else is going on.
right. Exactly. Well, we have time for Kieran's question. Yeah, so Kieran's asking about any insights for master's degree students trying to break into the biotech industry.
Yeah, yes, because it's funny. My head of research in my group, John Piercy, he has a master's degree. And he leads PhDs. He's one of the best researchers in gene therapy in the world, and he has a master's degree. And he came in right out of graduate school. He was at Penn. He decided after his prelims he didn't want to get a PhD. He was too impatient and the like, and that's him, right? And he left and he joined Bluebird, and that was 13 years ago. And the thing that he did that I think is really remarkable is he became a problem solver. And he didn't focus on one thing. He worked on manufacturing issues and set up some of the manufacturing the therapies. He worked on clinical issues when they arose, and he did that. He worked on just some of the understanding of the adverse events that occur in gene therapy. Because he's such a good scientist and so ridiculously smart, it helped him a lot too. But so my point is, if there will be opportunities for master's students in industry, actually quite well. And the key is, though, and I just used his example, is don't be afraid don't pigeonhole yourself in one thing, and be a problem solver across multiple types of problems.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. You don't have to have a degree to set you up at a certain level necessarily, right?
No.
If you're focused on the details. Now, I just want to point out, Angela had put a resource in the chat about the Duke Scholars in Molecular Medicine. I've been peripherally involved with that, and it's a great opportunity for PhD students to get exposure clinically to enhance their skills and understanding of the clinical environments. Yeah, great. Other questions?
Terrific. Well, thank you so much to Chris and Rich for the wonderful conversation today. Such a pleasure to learn from both of you. And thank you to our audience for your terrific questions and making it so engaging. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll join us for upcoming conversations with senior leaders reflecting on the value of their Duke education as part of this series. Good day, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Appreciate it.